Welcome to the weSpeak podcast series. I'm Joy Osiagwu, your host for the 4 episodes. weSpeak is a 5-year program of research and related activities focusing on the African, Caribbean, and Black ACB heterosexual men in Ontario to address their health needs, interest, and vulnerability to HIV. The 5-year project, which began in 2016 to 2021, was conducted by a team of researchers, community stakeholders, and ACB Men in Ontario. For the first episode of the podcast, Dr. Winston Husbands, a driving force behind several community and policy initiatives to address HIV-related health disparities experienced by Black communities in Ontario, and a co-principal investigator for the weSpeak program, will share the concept of the study and the essence of the focus on Black heterosexual men. Also speaking on the episode is co-investigator Wesley Oakes, Senior Lead, Strategic Partnerships and Health Equity Initiatives at the Ontario HIV Treatment Network. Thanks for staying with us. The weSpeak program had a forerunner called iSpeak. Dr. Winston Husbands gives a brief chronicle of iSpeak and how it led to the concept of weSpeak study.
iSpeak was a study that we did in 2011 to 2013, and it was a study of heterosexual Black men and HIV in Ontario. There is in Ontario a body called the African and Caribbean Council on HIV and AIDS in Ontario, or ACHO, and one of the members of ACHO at the time, who was an executive director of an organization called Africans in Partnership Against AIDS. She had brought this to the attention of the ACHO group. She said that, there was a lot of work going on with our organizations and our allies with Black women, but essentially Black women's exposure to HIV came from their relationship with Black men. So we needed to really engage Black heterosexual men, that is. So that's where the concept of iSpeak came along. Myself and Fanta and others developed a proposal to do basically a preliminary study of heterosexual Black men in Ontario to understand what were some of their challenges, some of their priorities, and also their potential related to the engagement in the work about HIV that was going on across the province. In developing that study, we were successful in getting funding to do that work. And then Wesley came on board after we got started. And, Wesley's interest, he was preparing to do some a different research study in Black communities. And we pulled his arm and said, no, Wesley, you got to join our team, and you got to make Black men the focus of your research going forward. So, that's one of our successes, actually.
So what motivated Wesley Oakes and the team to focus on Black heterosexual men?
Black men seemed to be invisible when it came to conversations, serious conversations about HIV and the experiences that heterosexual Black men were experiencing, right? There wasn't a lot in the literature out there in terms of the research. And what we were seeing is that at the service provision level, there were real barriers, right, for heterosexual Black men to be engaged. There weren't always programs there that were available for them. And in the odd instance where programs were available, they weren't always welcoming, right? So spaces within the community weren't always constructive for or safe for heterosexual Black men to have these conversations that we wanted to have. This is sort of the spirit that formed iSpeak and went on to inform the weSpeak study. It's how do we tell a different story about heterosexual Black men? How do we try to understand from their perspective some of the issues, right, that they struggle with in relation to negotiating safer sex, relationships, identity, sexuality, patriarchy, and so on.
The social structures may have neglected black heterosexual men in HIV programs and related conversations over time. Dr. Husbands explain why.
There was a great deal of concern about HIV and black women. There was also a great deal of concern about HIV and black gay men. There always had been from the start of the epidemic. Part of the problem that we had is that there was this feeling that, well, heterosexual black men are not really interested in these kinds of issues. They're not really interested in talking about HIV. They don't want to be associated with it. Some of us also sort of, digested some of these stereotypes about black men that were around. Well, it's difficult to get black men to talk about themselves, talk about health, and talk about sex and sexuality and masculinity, what it means to be a man, and black men don't really want to talk about those things. And, and also black men are unruly, they're not really, they don't really hold up their end of the bargain. Those kinds of stereotypes. Part of our purpose then, as Wesley suggested, was really to complicate that sort of quote unquote wisdom that circulates in Canadian society, but also in black communities about black men and about heterosexual black men, to really get to the heart of the matter and interrogate at the same time some of those myths and stereotypes that are so popular, but also so damaging.
The interrogation of the stereotypes became one of the main issues for the black men in the open spaces for conversations. Vulnerability was a significant theme, says Oakes.
The weSpeak study that we implemented really gave us an idea, right, of sort of what to look out for. And so we already knew from that preliminary research that, one, black men wanted to talk about their experiences around being a man and masculinity with other men. They wanted to share space. They wanted to have conversations. And this was an issue that came up, in our research, in the focus groups for the weSpeak study. And it was quite powerful, right? There are a lot of stereotypes out there that, would lead us to believe that black men don't want to be vulnerable. Certainly not with women, but especially not with other men. And what was great about this particular finding, it complicates this received knowledge that we think we already know.
Dr. Husbands corroborates Oakes' analysis. He says the study revealed that black men want to be productively involved in black communities and respond to HIV conversations just like everyone else.
We never thought about what those pathways to their involvement might be, because we went on this idea that, well, men, not only black men, but maybe men in general, they don't like to talk about these things, this, etc. Well, I think that we've established that all of those things are really not as we understood them. When we talk about resilience in relation to HIV or resilience in relation to health, we do not link that back to the pressures that we face ever since slavery, just being black in these kinds of societies.
What has migration got to do with the vulnerability of ACB men? Hear what Wesley Oakes has to say.
This is really a diverse group of men, not only geographically in terms of the different sites where we were able to have these conversations with men, but also thinking about the cultural background of these men. So migration does something. It makes you really critical of your environment, makes you really critical of yourself, and can help you reevaluate some of these things that you yourself thought you sort of had taken for granted, right? So these normative identities that we perform and do every day that we don't think about, suddenly become identities that we have to engage with in a way that is much more conscious, right? And that has to do with both, things like our sexuality and our masculinity, but also questions around race, right? What does it mean to be black in a country like ours? Right? And how does that influence other identities that make up who we are?
The study revealed a new dimension to what society thought they knew about black men. Dr. Husbands observed that black men do not have a singular identity.
They're, different versions. They sort of propel men forward. You know what? As a man, I have to have a partner, a wife, however you want to call that. And if I have children, I have to be a provider. That's what I have to do, and I have to do things that sort of insulate those people close to me from the things that happen to us in this society. On the other hand, at the same time, those same men and others will tell us about their ideas about fluid sexualities and how we must come to terms with those things. And they will also tell us, well, but I have to be a provider and so on, but I can't just be a provider. There are other things about me as well that I have to be. And on one hand, there's this sort of traditional way that men understand themselves, and then there are these emerging perspectives as well that men are sort of ruminating about and practicing and experimenting with as they move forward in sort of understanding who they are.
But how willing were the participants to speak to HIV? Dr. Husbands tells us more.
No population group wants to actually take responsibility for that. But here, black people were being pushed into this thing where people were saying, well, this is your fault. So there's always been this reluctance to talk about HIV. But, we've come a long way since then. And one of the remarkable things is that so many men were willing to talk, not just about what it means to be a man and those sorts of things, but to sort of relate all of that to the issue of HIV. Of course, we created conditions in which it was possible for men to talk about this, but that is what they needed, actually, an opportunity. In fact, some of the men told us, wow, I've never had this opportunity before, just to sit down with other men and talk about these issues in a way in which, nobody was threatened or nobody was made to feel, bad or whatever the case may be. Those men have been ruminating on their role in how we can respond to HIV, all of this time that they have actually been not included in this dialogue.
Another powerful message that sort of comes out in these conversations around HIV, right, which are difficult conversations because of the stigma, is that, these men think about HIV in this larger holistic understanding about their health, right? They want to live healthy lives and they want their community and their partners to be healthy, right? And that was a really powerful message. And sometimes, they admit that their ability to live healthy lives sometimes is challenging, right? Sometimes they don't always make the healthiest decision. They don't always negotiate sex in a way that could ensure their own health and the well-being and the health of others. But there's a desire there to want to be a part of a movement, if it's the response to HIV, that will improve community health.
The team adopted the concept mapping approach to gain insights and perspective from the focus groups and in-depth interviews. Dr. Husbands and Oakes say it brought out aspects of black men contrary to the mundane beliefs.
A lot of what emerged was not the sort of thing that you hear most often, like use a condom. And those things came up, you must use a condom, or, this kind of thing. Of course, those things came up. But what also came up was about how black men and black communities need better access to the social determinants of health. It's not just about using a condom. That's one thing. But what makes us vulnerable to HIV? What leads us down a path where we can't sort of think and act well in regard to our health? A lot of what emerged had to do with policies around those kinds of things. Those other things about the systemic issues were also quite strong.
We have to understand that in order for us to end HIV in our community, we need to address all these other things that frame our vulnerability more broadly, right? So addressing these things around access, for example, to primary care. How many of us have primary care doctors that we see on a regular basis? Addressing these larger issues around mental health. Are we able to have conversations about mental health in our community, and how does that inform our ideas of self and how we negotiate sex and so on? That's also important. We need to address real issues around, access to jobs. We need to live in safe communities. We need to have adequate housing. We need to eat healthy food, right? We need to feel safe, right? And not fear violence all the time, right? And so these things are what come together to allow us to really respond to HIV. These are the bigger pieces of the larger puzzle that informs HIV transmission in our community.
The podcast's second episode will focus on Black men and communities in dialogue on HIV vulnerabilities and collective resilience. Our guests on the edition are Brendan Hay, the founder of the Black Daddies Club, and Andrea Herriot, a high school teacher and weSpeak team member. weSpeak research is funded by the Ontario HIV Treatment Network and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research.